right? And Kennedy's...
Unknown sources.
Yeah, unknown sources. Well, the story was going to be written by a columnist by the name of James Reston about rumors of invasion of Cuba based on military troop movements in Florida. What had happened is the military was preparing in Florida, people got wind of that, and all of a sudden they're going to run a story about the problems in Cuba. Well, O'Donnell was just panicked, and he quickly called President Kennedy to inform him of the situation and the dangers if something came out in the press before his Monday night speech. So the president calls James Reston and asks him to hold the story, and Reston informs President Kennedy it was not his call to make. Okay, so the president then calls the publisher of the New York Times, Orville Dreyfus, and he tried to persuade Dreyfus to hold on Reston's story until after his speech Monday night to the American people. And Dreyfus hesitated. He said, you know, he held a similar story at your request before the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he regretted it ever since. It was big news that he lost. And anyway, Dreyfus asked Kennedy what he was going to say to his reporters. What am I going to say to these reporters that worked so hard for this story? What am I going to tell them? You know, after I already suppressed them on the Bay of Pigs and they went nuts, what am I going to tell them on this one? And Kennedy's response was, tell them they'll be saving lives, including their own. So that was kind of interesting. So after this comment, Orville Dreyfus decided to comply with the president's request and hold the story till after his Monday night speech to the country.
Randy?
Yeah.
In your readings, because I was just scanning this Eisenhower book, he also conferred with Eisenhower.
He did. Yeah, he did. And actually conferred with Truman also. Yeah. He did ask for some help, and I don't know if they had very good advice for him. You know, it was a tough...
The one advice that Kennedy asked Eisenhower if he thought the Soviets would initiate a nuclear war, and Mike sort of said, no, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think that was the same as what LeMay said. The only choice given to them is one they can't choose. But I'm pretty sure they'd have went into Berlin.
Yeah, there's something here about, in our discussions, exchanges on Berlin and other international questions, and one thing that has not concerned me has been the possibility that our government will not correctly understand the will and determination of the United States.
Yeah.
And that's Kennedy talking to Khrushchev.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. On Sunday morning, October 21st, President Kennedy attended Mass at St. Stephen's Church. And after the services, the President asked Bobby Kennedy to inform Kenneth O'Donnell that he wanted to meet with General LeMay again about the scenario of airstrikes, because he had not made up his mind as of Sunday morning which way he was going to go. Well, LeMay had invited General Walter Sweeney, who was the commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command, to the meeting also. And General Sweeney was there to provide further information about the scenarios of airstrikes against the missiles and missile sites in Cuba. Well, President Kennedy asked General Sweeney if the airstrikes could guarantee 100% destruction of the missiles in Cuba. And Sweeney stated he could only guarantee the destruction, 100% destruction of the missiles of the ones they knew about. Okay? He said, if we can target them, we can take them out, but I'm not going to guarantee it that we know where they all are. General LeMay kind of stepped in and guaranteed the Air Force would destroy over 90% of the missiles. And then President Kennedy informed the two military leaders that he would brief congressional leaders the next evening at 5 p.m. Okay, he was going to tell the top congressional leaders in the Congress what his plans were, because they had no idea what his plans are, and he was going to give them a heads up before he went on the air. Well, the President then told General Maxwell Taylor of his intentions to put the United States Armed Forces worldwide on DEFCON 3 at 7 o'clock Monday night. And if you know the DEFCON procedure, DEFCON 5 is normal peacetime readiness, DEFCON 4 is normal increased intelligence and strengthened security measures, DEFCON 3 is increase in force readiness above normal readiness, and if you go to DEFCON 2, it's further increase in force readiness but less than the maximum readiness, and then DEFCON 1 is maximum force readiness. So we're sitting in the middle.
Sitting on the Christmas tree and their bombers and the engines are running.
Right, that's right. So you have an increase in force readiness, and they're ready to go if they have to go. So that's how that day ended. Now Monday is the interesting day in the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the day that he tells the American people. So on Monday morning, as you mentioned, Fran, he placed telephone calls to former presidents Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. and briefed them on the situation and got their opinions. And then he wrote a correspondence to Soviet Premier Khrushchev that morning stating, quote, "I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into a war which it is crystal clear no country could win and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world." And he sent that note over to Khrushchev. And then Pierre Salinger announced that morning to the press, quote, that President Kennedy will address the nation tonight on radio and television on a subject of the highest national urgency. So he lets the people of the United States know the president's going to talk. Well, prior to his speech that evening, President Kennedy made quite a few preparations. First of all, he ordered the Navy to begin preparations for the blockade of Cuba. He actually drew a line in the sand, so to speak, on how far he would let Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before action would be taken. He informed military personnel that if the merchant ships crossed this point, entering American waters, the merchant ships would be attacked. And he made it clear that war would be declared by the United States upon the Soviet Union if the quarantine line was ignored. So he's made his choice. He's going to go with the naval quarantine or blockade. Well, at 5 o'clock Eastern Standard Time that evening, he briefs Congress on his decision to enact a quarantine of Cuba. And he becomes very angry and frustrated when he realizes that he has very little support by members of Congress for that action. And Kenneth O'Donnell, he came back in the office and he was really upset. And Kenneth O'Donnell, this is kind of part of his job, he knew he needed to settle President Kennedy down before he got on national television because he was very angry that he couldn't get support from Congress. So as a result, O'Donnell asked the president for a word before he left for his national address. And President Kennedy tried to explain, "Kennedy, I don't have time, I don't have time." And that's a great quote. O'Donnell insists to him, because they're very good friends, he says, "You're the President of the United States. They can wait for you." And that's the point he made. And he proceeded to settle the president down prior to his departure to the Oval Office to give his speech, because he was pretty wound up and upset with the Congress. Yeah.
Now, do we have a war act that has to be approved by Congress still in place at this time?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So he really can't declare war?
No,
It's
if they
all
cross that.
rhetoric at
Right,
this point.
it is rhetoric, that's exactly right. Well, at 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, Secretary of State Dean Rusk formally notifies Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin of the contents of the president's speech. So the Russians know at 6 o'clock, an hour before the speech, what Kennedy's intentions are. And that was done on purpose, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk was the one that told Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin what was in the president's speech. Well, at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time that evening, President Kennedy addresses the nation concerning the crisis in Cuba, and he basically tells the American people the following. He tells them about the missile construction sites in Cuba. He tells them that there are already missiles in Cuba. He tells them that the fact is that the Soviet Union were denying that were there any missiles or construction sites in Cuba. He also informed them on his decision to enact a blockade of Cuba, and he also told them the seriousness of his actions if Cuba would make the decision to launch any missiles against the United States. He said, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." So it basically tells the American people, if they decide to launch any missiles out of Cuba, we will retaliate. It doesn't even have to beat us, anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. So that's kind of how that day ended. Well, this is even a more interesting day on Tuesday, because they haven't really put the blockade into effect yet. They've got a time when the clock's going to hit midnight, so to speak, and they're going to say now. Well, the morning of October 23rd, ExCom met again. The president's greatest concern was what action the Navy would take if the Soviet ships did not stop at the quarantine line. So Bobby Kennedy steps in and he asks General George Anderson, that's the fellow over there in the Time magazine, but he asked Admiral George Anderson to clarify what the rules of engagement will be if the Soviet ships do not stop at the quarantine line. So Admiral Anderson briefs ExCom on the official rules of engagement. Step 1 would be the Navy would attempt to make radio contact with approaching Soviet ships using sailors fluent in Russian. Second step, The Soviet ships would be ordered to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. The third step would be the Navy inspection team would board and search the Soviet vehicle. And step 4 is if the vessel contained offensive weapons, the ship would be ordered to turn back out of the quarantine zone. That was the rules of engagement at the quarantine line. Well, Bobby asked Admiral Anderson what course of action will be taken if the Soviet ships refuse to be searched. And Admiral Anderson's response was that if the Russians refused to be searched, they would be towed into the nearest port. Well, Bobby continued and said, well, what will be the course of action if the Soviet ships simply run the blockade? And Anderson went through that scenario. He said the first step is the Navy would shoot a warning shot across the bow of the Soviet ship, and if the ship ignored the warning shot, the Navy would fire at the ship's rudder, disabling the ship and carry on with the inspection anyway. Well, at that point, President Kennedy stepped in the conversation, and he made it incredibly clear that there would be no firing on any ship in the quarantine zone without his explicit permission. He did not want this thing to go rogue. So they kind of have a little bit of a debate about that. Now, this is another interesting story because the next topic of discussion that morning included the military's need for further spy flights over Cuba, because they want to see if these launching pads are getting operational or close to operational. These are going to be low-level flights on the deck, not the ones way high that got them the photos, but these are going to be on the deck because they need those to get the best photographs of those missiles and missile launching pads to make sure that they're not operational. Well, the flights are going to be very risky, and the chances of the airplanes being shot at are going to be extremely high. And the military made it very clear that morning what action would be taken if their pilots were shot at during these low-level flights. You know, they would retaliate. That's what you do. Well, President Kennedy listened to this discussion and finally agreed to allow these low-level surveillance to continue. He okayed the flights. Well, this made Kenneth O'Donnell very nervous because he believed the president was getting set up by the military, because there was no question when these spy planes go on the deck over Cuba, they're going to be fired upon. No question. And both the Russians and the Cubans were aware that the United States knew of the missiles at this time and those construction sites in Cuba. And so neither Castro nor the Cuban military would know whether these American planes that were flying on the deck were carrying cameras or they're carrying bombs at this point, for sure. Well, O'Donnell just was upset about this. He really felt like the military was setting the president up because they wanted to airstrike and invade. And that certainly would guarantee it if they had to retaliate with these pilots. So O'Donnell firmly stated to President Kennedy, the planes are going to be shot at. And he knew if the planes are fired on, it would be the president's responsibility to protect the pilots. Well, protecting these pilots would result in military airstrikes in Cuba, followed by invasion, the action that he was absolutely trying to avoid. So he really felt the president was getting set up. Well, the president insisted on granting permissions to O'Donnell, and he knew that they needed the flights. They had to find out if those sites were operational, exactly how many missiles were on the ground. So O'Donnell knew it was going to be his job to find a solution for this problem. So he excuses himself, and he calls a commander by the name of William B. Ecker, who's going to be one of the 2 pilots that's flying these low-level missions. And he gets him on the phone, and he says, I got to pass an order to you on you from President Kennedy. And Ecker says, yes, sir. And he says, don't get shot down. A surprised Ecker responded to O'Donnell's request, and O'Donnell went on to further explain, quote, now I've known the man for 15 years. The problem is he will protect you. So I am asking, don't make him protect you. Don't get shot at. Like it was his ability not to do that. Well, during the successful mission, both Ecker and Lieutenant Bruce Wellamy were heavily fired upon. I mean, they were 50 caliber bullets going through the wings, and they don't get shot down. They get the pictures. Well, afterwards, as you can imagine, well, it's kind of funny because during the movie that you watched, 13 Days, and it's actually fairly accurate. When they came in, all their buddies were kind of impressed about all the the 50 caliber bullet holes through their wings, and when they came off the plane, all of them said, "Hey, geez, what happened?" And Ecker said, "Bird strikes. These were bird strikes." And one guy says, "Are these 50 caliber bird strikes or something to that effect?" And they said, "That's it, guys, bird strikes." That's what they were. Well, Commander Ecker then gets asked by his superior officers to develop the film he took personally to the Pentagon, which was very, very unusual. And when O'Donnell found out about it, he's nervous. Well, Ecker actually has the foresight to call Kenneth O'Donnell at the White House and say, "Hey, sir, what's going on here? They asked me to deliver this film to the Pentagon personally." And he said, "Well, they're going to ask you if you were shot at." And O'Donnell again emphasized the importance of not being shot at when those superiors ask him. So Ecker personally delivers the film to the Pentagon, and he's asked directly by General LeMay, "Son, I want to know just one thing. Those bastards shoot as much as a BB gun at you?" And Ecker responded by saying, "It was a cakewalk, sir." And that was all he'd say. Anyway, so back at the White House, President Kennedy was speaking with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, and the topic of discussion was a vote that was going to be conducted by the Organization of American States. And that was just a little bit under the UN. And the Organization of American States were going to vote either to support or not support the United States' actions concerning the quarantine of Cuba. And Kennedy pushed Secretary of State to ensure that a unanimous vote in support of the quarantine was secured by the Organization of American States. And when Rusk stated to the President there had never been a unanimous vote in the history of the Organization of American States, President Kennedy's response back to Rusk was, "Get the unanimous vote." And by God, he did. The vote came back that evening unanimously to support American actions there. As a result, at 7:06 p.m. on that day, President Kennedy signed Proclamation 3504, which officially authorized the naval quarantine of Cuba. And that this quarantine would go into effect at 10 a.m. the next morning, which was Wednesday, October 24th. Okay, so it is in law, so to speak. Now, to end this very stressful and busy day, Kennedy received some more bad news. Those additional photographs that were taken by Commander Ecker and Lieutenant Willoughby showed missile launching pads clearly defined and closer to readiness. And a regularly scheduled hydrogen bomb test was initiated by the United States military off Johnston Island in the South Pacific, something they probably should have canceled considering the circumstances. But that just kind of shows you, although it was routine, the test was very unfortunate considering the tense circumstances, and some people believe that was the military's way of continuing this. Because I'm telling you, the military was ready, they wanted to go. They were tired of this negotiation stuff. Well, on Wednesday, October 24th, according to historians, this day proved to be the most trying day in the entire crisis. President Kennedy actually sent Secretary of Defense McNamara to the Pentagon so he could directly communicate with him. I think he wanted to make sure he had eyes and ears on the ground at the Pentagon to make sure that his directives were followed. Well, shortly before 10 a.m., McNamara reported from the Pentagon to ExCom at the White House, who had all gathered with President Kennedy, that there was no sign of the Soviet ships stopping. They were still coming full bore. And McNamara informed the committee that the Soviet ships were still continuing toward the quarantine line, and at 10 a.m. President Kennedy announced to the Pentagon that the quarantine line was officially in effect. Well, shortly after 10 a.m., Secretary of Defense McNamara announced the first two Soviet ships, the Gagarin and the Kimhovs, were within just a few miles of the quarantine zone. And pressure mounts as the two ships are now joined by a Soviet submarine which had moved into position between the two ships. And there wasn't any doubt that that submarine was there to protect those two freighters. Well, standing on guard right at the quarantine line was a battleship known as the USS John R. Pierce, where they were going to enforce the rules of engagement if they needed to. Well, Kennedy realized that the Soviet submarine was a serious threat to the USS John R. Pierce because the battleship was in a very vulnerable position. That submarine could have sunk that battleship in no time. So before a determination could be made on the intent of the Gagarin and Kimhovs, President Kennedy ordered the captain of the USS Pierce to force that submarine to the surface. And torpedoes would be used to bring the submarine to the surface, which could cause major damage to the submarine and probably force the hand of the Soviet Union. They would see that obviously as an act of aggression. Well, President Kennedy asked the captain of the USS Pierce if he could force the submarine to the surface without damaging it. And the captain's response was, quote, "I can bring the sub to the surface, but whether it's damaged or not is up to the sub." That was his word. Well, suddenly, At like 10:25 a.m., CIA Director John McCone reports to the committee that the two ships had stopped short of the line and were actually turning around. Kennedy had given this order to go ahead and bring the sub to the surface. Well, after McCone's announcement was officially confirmed, Kennedy immediately ordered the captain of the USS Pierce to belay that order. And it was later revealed that the Soviet submarine actually held 20 torpedoes, including one nuclear torpedo. And so we were lucky that they didn't, fire upon that submarine at the time, because the other two ships decided to turn around and go back. Well, finally, after all the excitement, when it was verified that the Soviet ships did stop short of the quarantine line, and relieved Secretary of State Dean Rusk stated, "We were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fellow just blinked." Hannah, is this making any sense back there? Yes, it is. Well, CIA Director McCone then reported that 20 other Soviet ships either stopped short of the quarantine zone or already turned around. So this quarantine is working. However, there were 6 Soviet freighters that continued toward Cuba and the quarantine line. Now, discussions between the ex-com and Secretary of Defense McNamara, who's at the Pentagon, continued on what to do with these 6 ships that are still en route. Most of them had stopped short or turned around. Finally, Secretary McNamara interjected the following concerning the Soviet ships. He stated that 4 of the ships were still a day away from the quarantine line. He also believed that the commanders of those 6 ships had not yet received their orders to turn around. McNamara stated that the ships the United States suspected of carrying weapons had already stopped or turned around. And he strongly recommended that the other 2 ships that were still coming, one including the Bucharest, be allowed to cross the quarantine line, stating, "We sure would look bad